Hello everyone, today is March 27th, Tuesday. I'm recording this video in the middle of the day just before I start grading my other classes. I apologize first of all for not having a lecture up for week 9 or week 10. Obviously week 9 was spring break, so there didn't need to be a lecture there. But week 10 I was sick most of the week and I had no voice, I couldn't record anything. So I apologize for that, and I had several of you email me about some of the material, and I was happy to offer instructions for that. But this video is going to try to catch everybody up on the first part of the prospectus, just to sort of clarify some of the things I noticed that need to be improved, and give you some feedback on what to prepare for part 2, which is due April 1st, this Sunday. It's a little less than a week away. The instructions are already up, as well as the rubric, in the week 11 folder under course materials. If you haven't read them, I encourage you to read them first before you watch this video, so that way, as I explain things, it makes a little bit more sense. And if you still have more questions, of course, feel free to email me or text me. So let's talk about the instructions first for part 1. Because some of you did some odd things for the assignments. I already finished grading everybody's for the online class, and one of the things I noticed is that a lot of you, I think, went online and Googled how to do a prospectus and tried to follow whatever examples you found. If you did that, you likely did not get a very good grade on this part of the assignment, because this is only part 1 of a prospectus. Some of you did something that looked like an entire prospectus, and the problem with that is that I'm trying to scaffold these assignments and build them off on one another. So for this for part 1, it required no research whatsoever. In fact, that's why I called it pre-research. It's before you do any research. I wanted you to answer these questions, and none of these questions required you to do any sort of research. Now, if you wanted to know a little bit more about your topic, a quick Google search or Wikipedia is perfectly okay, and frankly, that's not considered research anyway. So if you decided to do that, that's fine. More power to you. But a lot of you included a works cited page, which again was completely unnecessary. If you did that, I didn't take points away, but I did take points away if you failed to answer these questions, which unfortunately many of you did. In the future, if you have an assignment you're not sure about it, don't Google it and try to find out more about it outside of class. It might not align with what I'm asking. Instead, just ask me directly. I'm always available, at least through text and email. So always feel free to email me with specific questions, and I can answer them that way instead of doing guesswork on your end. For the most part, though, the majority of you did do what I asked, and I think generally you guys did well on this assignment. I only had a handful of students who didn't, and I suspect again that it was sort of a panic about not knowing what to do. So that's all that you needed to do for part 1. Part 1 was essentially just asking you what your topic was, what research question you're going to have, how it's going to tie into the theme of the course, and the theme, of course, that's listed here. What did you know about the topic so far? Why is it important to you? And where you expect to find and conduct your research. For part 2 now, and again, these you can find part 2 in the week 11 folder. It's assumed that you've already selected a topic and addressed the questions. Now, if during part 2, and I'll clarify this in a little bit, if during part 2 it turns out you want to change topic or change your research question or change your thesis, whatever the case might be, that's perfectly fine. There is nothing wrong with changing as you go. If you decide that you want to do a completely different topic, part 2 does not affect part 1. Okay, so if you said something in part 1 and you contradict yourself in part 2, it's not like I'm going to change the grade for part 2 because of part 1. They're completely separate. And the reason I made them separate is precisely because I've had students in the past who do a single prospectus, and then by the time they start the research paper, they realize they want to do something completely different. So by putting it in stages like this, it's easier for me to track your progress and your plan towards research. So for this assignment, it's very similar to part one in that I've given you questions that you need to answer. And again, how you order them is up to you. Something else I noticed from part one is that some of you sort of just wrote a paragraph for each question, for each bullet that I have here. If you did that, you did answer the questions, and that's good, but then you suffered in organization. Because these questions are not in any particular order. And in fact, if you answer them in a bulleted form like this, you're very likely going to, it's not going to make as much sense. So it was up to you to decide how you want to organize the paper so that the flow is easy to understand, and that your reader can sort of understand your logic and your train of thought. So I am not giving you any sort of guidance about how I want this to look like. There is no set way to write a prospectus. There's all kinds of ways you can write it. I'm giving you as much freedom as possible, but that does mean that you need to carefully plan it out. So let me go over some of the questions here. I mentioned here, I want to know what type of sources you've found so far. And keep in mind that as you're finding sources, you should be deciding what type of research paper you're going to write. Are you going to write an argumentative research paper, or are you going to write an analytical research paper? If you don't know what I mean by that, there is this link that I've included here from OWL Purdue, and it goes a little bit into what research is and what research isn't. And it goes over the two types of research papers. There's argumentative and analytical here, and there's some examples that are mentioned here. If you're not sure what I mean by that, again, I'll clarify more as we get closer to the actual research paper, but this should give you an idea. And not all research papers are argumentative or analytical. Some can be a combination of the two. Others are what we call synthetic research papers, where they sort of combine or summarize the research that's already out there and try to show the direction that it's going in. Which again, I suppose that would be a type of analytical paper, but generally we don't do synthetic papers at this level. So again, I want to know what type of sources you have found, right, based on whatever topic you decided. If you change your topic, please let me know here, and of course that way I know how your sources are relating to that. I'm asking, this is an optional question, this is the only optional question here. Will you personally conduct research? And if so, how will you collect data? I suspect that maybe one or two of you might want to do interviews or surveys or polls. It's very difficult and it's time consuming, but if you'd like some direction on that, I can help you. But I don't recommend it just because it's a lot of work. This is an online class, which means I don't have as much interaction with you as I do with my face-to-face classes. So it might be harder to give you as much guidance as I need to have a successful independent research study. I also want to know what your preliminary research has revealed about your topic that you did not know before. And this obviously ties into part one, because part one you told me what you knew so far. Now, after doing some research, hopefully that may have informed your knowledge and even changed your mind about something. So here is going to be your chance to talk about every source that you've found. It doesn't have to be a very long paragraph for each source, but enough so that your reader can see exactly how that source is relevant to your topic. Of course, I want to know if you're going to write an argument or analysis and whether or not your research question has changed from part one. Obviously, when we're doing research, there is some sort of ongoing discourse or conversation in academia within whatever field or discipline that you're doing your research in. So I want to know how your research is advancing or furthering that discourse. How are you, everything you were writing is going to be or have to be new in some way. It can't just be a rehashing of what other people have already said. So every paper that will be submitted for this class must be something that's new and unique. It cannot be something that's already been done. Of course, I want to know what your tentative thesis statement is. By tentative here, I mean, for now, what is your thesis statement? Of course, that can change. And finally, I want to know, why is this topic important to your community, which is different from the last one, right? The last question I asked was, why is this topic important to you? Now, I want to know, why is this important to everybody around you? I had one of my students earlier this week. She said that she was doing same-sex schools. That was her topic. And when I asked her, why is this important to you? And she said, well, it's because it's interesting. I said, well, that's not really a great answer, but okay, it's interesting. Is it interesting automatically to everybody else then? And she says, well, no, of course not. And the reality is, at some level, she's going to have to do some work and show why it's important to everybody else, even though she doesn't know for a fact. Okay, now, just like the first part, or part one, part two will need to be written in the standard essay format, right? Multiple paragraphs, all well developed. The difference, though, between the first one and the second one are right here. The second one is going to be slightly longer, at least 700. I suspect some of you might even go all the way to 1,000. It just depends on the type of how much work you're including. But the other significant difference is this, is that you need to find and read at least 2 scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles that you will summarize and discuss in response to the questions above. And I've recommended 2 excellent resources. One are the library's databases. Actually, those are many resources, and Google Scholar. I'm going to go over both in this lecture shortly. This is, again, all due April 1st by the end of day. So I want to talk about a couple of things. You might still have questions about what I mean by ongoing discourse, and you might still have questions about what I mean by scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. So I'm going to answer them both by showing you, introducing you to Google Scholar first. Okay. Now, Google Scholar, if you're not familiar with it, it's a type of search engine, just like Google, and you can find it easily just by Googling the word scholar, or if you type in Google Scholar in your search bar, it'll come up here too. And once you click on this link, this is the page you should see. It looks like Google. It looks the exact same as Google. It has a search bar and everything. The difference is it has the word scholar after it, and it seems to limit it into 2 categories, either articles or case law. We're not dealing with criminal justice or legal material, so we're going to go do articles here. And when we search something, you can be as general or as specific as you want. Let me try being general for now. If I type in, I'll pick a random topic. Let's say something like rape culture. Okay, that was one of the topics that I listed, and this is obviously really general term. But what I'm going to do is when I press enter, I'm going to get 797,000 hits, and that's of all time. I haven't narrowed it down by date or anything. In fact, you'll notice that some are from 2005, 1996, 1988, and so on. Let me first show you how to read this page. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You'll notice here are titles of the materials, the sources, right here. This is a title, this is a title. Underneath it are the names of the authors. In this case, there are 3 authors of this book called Transforming a Rape Culture, Buchwald, Fletcher, and Roth. This was published in 2005, and the source comes from a government site, NCJRS. Okay. You'll also notice underneath here, there's a couple of interesting sort of tools that you can use. My favorite is this cited by. Cited by tells me that 417 other articles have cited this book. Now, what that tells me is that this book must be, popular and relevant to the topic. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good source, but it might be a source worth looking into, especially if it's more recent. This is pretty old. I think 2005 is pretty dated now. Some of you hadn't even gotten to high school yet. So I would be a little bit skeptical of the material that's here. So that said, it's still worth looking into. Now, some of these are accessible by PDF. You'll notice that there's a link to some of these in PDF. PDF is good because that means it's free usually, and you can just access it instantly. Some of these will say book. So if I try clicking on this link, for instance, It takes me off-site to NCGRS. This is the National Criminal Justice Reference Service. It gives me the name of the publication, and it provides me with the author's name, and it tells me that it was actually published in 1993. So 2005 must have been when it was uploaded to the site, not when it was published. We also know it's 470 pages. It's a collection of essays discussing rape and strategies to prevent it. And here is an abstract. This is a summary of the book. Okay, but notice I do not have a link to this book. It is just the abstract. It doesn't actually have access to the book. And that was kind of obvious based on the fact that there was no link here. Now, the cool thing is that if you are on campus anywhere, in any of the campuses for UTRGV, there's usually a link here that'll say find at UTRGV. And I'm going to talk more about how to find things at the UTRGV library shortly. If you do, that means you can access it regularly just by going through online. In fact, a lot of these sites you'll have automatic access to because you're a student at the university. If you're going off-site like I'm about to, you'll have to log in with your credentials to access some of these journals. But let's take a look at a different one. This one's coming from 1996, but you'll notice this one's a little bit different from this previous one. For one thing, it doesn't come from a .gov site, it comes from a .com. But before this year, notice there was nothing before this one. Now this one says Gender and Society. It includes the authors here, but says Gender and Society. This is a journal, and this is what I mean by journal articles. This is the name of the journal, Gender and Society. Now, when I go back to the instructions for a moment, it says I need scholarly, peer-reviewed journal articles. Well, scholarly here means the opposite of popular. So we don't want popular articles, we want scholarly articles. By popular, I mean things like Huffington Post, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, New York Times, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and so on and so forth. These are all popular sources. And we can notice a couple of differences between popular sources and these sources. For one thing, if you take a look at the Barbara Jean article that we read earlier about slavery, race, and ideology in the United States, or the West and Zimmerman article about sex and sexuality and doing gender, those are clearly scholarly sources because there's no advertising whatsoever on the actual page. There's a works cited page or a reference page included. Even the way material is sourced is done in a scholarly way. The goal of all scholars is to present information as openly and transparently as possible. Whereas journalists don't necessarily do that. Often they write stories with a slant. They only write about stories that are, let's say, interesting or have a lot of attention or grabbing. And sometimes they will hide their sources for a couple of reasons. Sometimes journalists want to have some job security. If they just give up their informant or who the informant is, then anyone can access that informant, and then they're out of a job. In some cases, it's to protect the informant's identity, either because they're whistleblowing about their own company or corporation, and they want to be protected somehow. So there are a lot of reasons why journalists tend to hide information, and often they only release so much information at a time, whereas scholars immediately want to reveal as much information as possible because there's no monetary gain from these, right? If I publish an article like this one, if this article is published on behalf of Boswell and Spade, they don't make any money off of it. It's just for the sake of research. And so the key here is to understand that journalists are commercial agents, whereas scholars and researchers are academic agents. They do it solely for the pursuit of knowledge. That is the goal. So that's what I mean here by scholarly articles. Now, peer-reviewed is a whole nother monster. When I say peer-reviewed, I mean that the article was reviewed by a colleague or some expert in the field in which that journal was, or in which that article was published. If we take a look at Gender and Society, well, we would expect that this sort of article was checked by either a sociologist or a behavioral psychologist or something of that kind who has some knowledge about this field before it was published. Well, peer review is a little different. When we think of peer review, we think, oh, someone is just checking my work. But in scholarship, we want to also avoid unethical practices like bias and nepotism. So it's sometimes tempting, for instance, I belong to a journal called the Journal of South Texas English Studies. I'm on the editorial board for this journal, which means that I have voting power to say if we have an article, we either accept or reject it. But, of course, if I can see who's submitting, if I see that, oh, it's a friend from work who's submitting to my journal, well, I'm totally going to, accept their article, and good for us, right? I helped a friend out. Well, that would be unethical, and it would be it would show a lack of academic integrity. So I don't want to do that. So there are two ways, or two types of peer review that are accepted in journal communities. One is called blind peer review. The other is double-blind peer review. Blind peer review is when, let's say, someone, I don't know who, submits their article to my journal. They want to publish in my journal. Well, instead of finding out who that person is and who sent that article, instead, it goes to a manager, a secretary for my journal. And that secretary's job is to remove all identifying information so that I can't see who sent it or who wrote it. And so when I get the article to review and the rest of my colleagues on the board review it, we do so without knowing who the author is, and we're just looking at the content. We just want to see whether the content is good or not. We don't know if this person's a doctor. We don't know if this person is even an expert in the field. All we see is the content, and we measure it or evaluate it based on its own merit. Okay. Now, the problem with that, though, is that as a board, one of the problems that my journal runs into frequently is that we all meet every quarter when we're about to publish an article, a journal, and we often have to confer with one another and say, well, what did you think of this article? Did you like it? Do you have any problems with it? Do you think it's worth publishing, and so on? We end up collaborating and conferring, but that in itself is also a type of bias, because then we're trying to persuade one another whether or not it should be published. And that happens with many journals when they're first getting started. And ours has been around for about 10 years now, so it's still a young journal. But the better process is double-blind peer review. Double-blind peer review is the same thing as blind. The bigger difference is, though, that the reviewers don't know each other, so that the article first is removed of all identifying information, so we have no idea who the submitter is. And on top of that, that article then gets disseminated. It gets spread to and sent to different reviewers, and the reviewers don't know who else is reviewing, right? I might get an article, and I have no idea who else around the country might be getting the same article to review, right? We're all connected to our journal, but we're not talking to one another about it. We just send in our vote and make our decisions, and usually the majority wins. Okay, that's key, because then we have our own honest opinion. No one else is trying to convince us whether or not what we're doing is correct or not. We're just having a vote. So that is the best way to review. Your job, as I'm showing here, your job will have to be to find at least two, again, scholarly, peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how do I know if a journal is peer-reviewed or not? Well, that's going to take a little bit of research on your part. So let's take this one, for example. I've never seen this article before. I have no idea. I've never read this article before. I have no idea about this journal. So I'm just going to do this with you. So bear with me. I know that the name of the journal is Gender and Society. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to search in a new Google bar, Gender and Society. And what do you know? When I first show up, we have a couple of links here that mention this journal. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this link. I have no idea. Let me show you a couple of things I just saw before we get into this. Notice here on the side it has a little bit of information. It says that it's a peer-reviewed, let me zoom in a little bit. It is a peer-reviewed academic journal. Well, just because it says it's peer-reviewed, it doesn't tell us the type of peer review it is. So I'm not going to take its word for it. So therefore, I'm going to go ahead and click in. And I'm taken to a page about the journal. It doesn't seem to have anything here, at least on this page. It does say that there's an editorial team. If I decide to look at who the editors are, maybe it'll tell me something here. I don't know why it needs to know my country, but okay. Let's see. Okay, so here are the editors. And there's lots of managing editors, deputy editors. There's a huge editorial board, but nothing about how they review their journals. So let's see. Maybe it'll tell us a little bit more in their aims and scope. Nope, it's a very short thing. How about submission guidelines? Process. Manuscripts that are accepted for review will be sent out anonymously for editorial evaluation. Okay, so we do know for a fact that's a type of blind peer review. I don't know what type, if it's blind or double blind. They don't claim it anywhere else. Here we go. Blind peer review process. This review process submitted is anonymous. We remove all material from the manuscript that identifies you. It'll be blinded, meaning there's no way for the reviewers to identify the author. And that's it. So it is a simple blind peer review. It's not double blind, but it's just a regular blind peer review. It's still very good. That's still a good idea. But at least we now know that the journal Gender and Society follows a blind peer review process. So if we decide to use this article, for instance, we can trust that it was reviewed blindly. Now, how do we access this journal? Well, one way to do it, a simple way to do it, just by clicking on this link, right? By clicking on it, we'll be taken to, let's say, a site somewhere. This one's Sage Journals. That happens to be the company that owns this journal. If we download the PDF, let's see if we can download it for free. It says that we need to access it somehow. It might mean that we need to do it through UTRGV, which means we'll have to find this journal elsewhere. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do that if we're just having this. So I'm going to leave this window open. The other thing we can do is try using this PDF link to the side. And let's see if we open it up successfully. See, now we were taken to JSTOR, and it says access is provided by UTRGV. Now, I have access because I'm logged into Blackboard. I had to sign into my UTRGV. So I have access to the library right now, and that's why I have access here. Notice I don't have to log in. I don't have to create an account with something. This is called a database called JSTOR. It's actually one of the better ones. I don't have to sign in with it because I already have access because I'm faculty with your university. You have access to this to similar databases for not for free, but you have access to it because of the tuition and fees that you pay to the university. So I see this article here. It's also Boswell Spade, same exact article. But now let me see if I can download the PDF. Yes, I accept the terms. And there we go. It looks like this is a 15-page article. And here is the title page. We have the authors here. Even a small, what we call an abstract. Abstracts are really important. They're like summaries of an article. So I'm going to read this one with you guys, and we're going to figure out what this article is about. So this one says, social interactions at fraternities that undergraduate women identified as places where there is a high risk of rape are compared to those at fraternities identified as low risk, as well as two local bars. Factors that contribute to rape are common on this campus. However, both men and women behaved differently in different settings. Implications of these findings are considered. So this might be interesting. This one's about fraternities and collegiate rape culture. Why are some fraternities more dangerous places for women instead of others? And so they go on and explain. Now, this is obviously a little bit old. This is from 1996, I think, if I read it correctly. Yes, 1996. It's very old, but at least now we understand how to actually go through it. Once you've identified, read the abstract and thought, well, yeah, you know what, this is definitely something I'd like to read and be interested in, then of course you would read the rest of the article for clarity. Okay. So in the meantime, I'm going ahead and leave this previous page open here, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. If you still have questions about, actually, you know what? There is one more thing I want to talk about Google Scholar for a moment. Obviously, we can limit some of these sources, right? If I'm doing rape culture, how do I answer the question in part 2? One of the questions was, what is the ongoing discourse or conversation within the field or discipline? Well, if I take a look at the articles here, some of these are going to be very old, so I'm not sure if they're still relevant. So one of the things I like to do is search for the last 4 or 5 years. Okay, and I'm going to read some of the titles here. We have Rape Culture and the Feminist Politics of Social Media, Rape Culture and Social Media, Young Critics and a Feminist Counterpublic, Rape Culture, Lad Culture and Everyday Sexism, Researching, Conceptualizing, and Politicizing New Mediations of Gender and Sexual Violence, Digital Feminist Activism, Religion, Feminist Hashtag Takeover, Speaking Unspeakable Things, Documenting Digital Feminist Responses, Digitizing Rape Culture. So notice, just by looking at some of the titles here, some of the key words I've seen are digitizing or digital and social media. And there was even one about hashtags. So clearly, social media gets mentioned a lot. In fact, right now we have 25,000 results since 2014. If I add the term social media, let's see how much further down it goes. It went down from 25,000 to 24,700, which means that of the 25,000 that we had seen since 2014, almost all of them are related to social media somehow. So that might tell us something already, that if we're going to do a topic on rape culture, a lot of what's going on right now is dealing with social media. Okay, so if you're going to do a research paper on this, your topic is probably going to have to add to social media somehow, because that seems to be the direction that most of these go in. And that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, let's say I pick a different topic altogether, like sexual harassment, right? Another way we can sort of, actually, let's do something different. Let's do transgender. Another thing we can do, if we come across titles that have nothing to do with our topic, I don't know, like Caribbean or HIV, if we don't care about these terms, if we don't want to know anything about HIV, I can hit this minus button or the hyphen and type in, let's say, HIV and press enter. Now I've gotten rid of all results that have the term HIV in it. And I can keep doing that, right? I can say minus, I don't want to know anything about medicine, for instance. And that lowered it down more. I don't want to know anything about psychology. I don't know why you'd want to get rid of it, but we'll get rid of it anyway. It got rid of a couple more things, and so on and so forth. Okay, you can limit it as much as you want. The more specific you are, obviously, the fewer results you'll find. Your job, of course, is to find this discourse, and that might be difficult to determine without having some, at least, broad ideas of what sort of research is being conducted right now. Okay. All right, let me go now, and I'm going to leave this off and instead talk a little bit about the library databases. Now, this is the UTRGV Libraries homepage. You'll notice that there's a search bar here. I don't recommend using this search bar because it's going to search everything from Brownsville and Edinburgh to what's in print and what's online. So it's going to be everything. I do not recommend doing that because then some of these things you might not have immediate access to. And in fact, that's, I think, a very long way of trying to find a journal article. Instead, I prefer using databases. So if you go under this Find tab here are databases, and there's two ways we can search databases. We can either look at the databases alphabetically, or we can go by subject. Now, since I think most of you are probably not familiar with databases, I would not recommend going alphabetically because that assumes you know all the databases that we have access to from our university, and you're going to be able to just find the one you're looking for. I don't recommend doing that. Instead, I would go by subject. Okay. When you click on that link, it'll have lots of links here to different subjects: philosophy and religion, geology, civil engineering, library science, linguistics, film, movies and videos, music, and so on. For our purposes, since we're doing cultural studies, chances are we're going to do mostly sociology, right? Sociology is a study of society and human behavior on a big scale, okay? So we're going to click on sociology, and when we do, and by the way, if you decide you want to do a different subject area, I have no problem with you picking a different subject area. That's perfectly fine. I'm just using this as an example, okay? Now, when we come here, you'll have a list of databases. All of them are linked here. These are the names of the databases, followed by a description of that database. Now, obviously, you might ask yourself, well, how do I know which database is a good one? Well, there are a couple of key terms we want to look for. For one thing, we want something that says full text. If it says full text, that means that it's going to offer articles that are complete, that are the full article. Some of these databases are intended only for citations or abstracts, meaning when you look in those databases, it's going to say, well, here's an abstract from these articles, but we don't actually have the whole article. So that won't be as useful. So we want full text. We also want one of these databases to talk about scholarly journals, because not all databases are limited to scholarly journals. Some of them have photography, some are film, some have newspaper clippings, and so on and so forth. You want to find the ones that are just scholarly journals. That said, let's take a look at a couple of these. Here we have something called iPoll. It is the largest collection of poll data anywhere, from 1935 to present. All U.S. polling firms, broad topical coverage of opinions and behavior on social issues, politics, pop culture, international affairs, and more. International data sets are available for immediate download as well. Well, notice nowhere here does it mention the term full text, and nowhere does it mention scholarly journals. In fact, this is just poll data. When people take a poll, they collect it all here. Which is pretty cool. If you're interested in what people are saying in polls, that might be a really great source, but it's not a source for scholarly journal articles. Well, let's take a look at the next one. This one's JSTOR. JSTOR is actually a really huge database that covers all the humanities. This is a full text database of back issues of scholarly journals in many academic disciplines, including sociology and other sciences, social sciences. Well, that might be a good one because it mentions full text and it mentions scholarly journals. Obviously, it's only related to sociology and social sciences, not physical sciences like physics, geology, biology, and so on. Continuing, we have Periodicals Archive Online. It says it contains full-page images to millions of articles from hundreds of journals in 37 subject areas within the humanities and social sciences, with deep chronological coverage going back over 200 years. Well, okay, it does mention journals and articles. That's good. Obviously, they're related to humanities and social sciences, which is what cultural studies is related to. But the key word here that bothers me is it mentions full-page images. It doesn't say full text. It says full-page images. That should be a flag, because that tells you this is going to be old. Okay. After OCR was invented, OCR is a way of capturing texts. When you scan a text, right? If you take a textbook, you put it on a scanner and you try to scan the textbook, most of the time before OCR, that would just scan it was like taking a picture of what was on the textbook, right? And if you got that picture and opened it up on your screen, you couldn't highlight the words, you couldn't edit inside the document. It's a picture, you can't do anything with it. Except go on top of it. But after the invention and improvement of OCR, we now can scan documents and be able to edit them and copy and paste the words that are inside of that, because we recognize it as text. Full page images is essentially saying these are pre-OCR texts. These are probably really old journal articles that were scanned and copied and saved into this database but they're not recent articles. And in fact, it tells us it's probably pretty old because it's an archive. It's not meant to have recent articles. So that might be a limitation. Still worth looking into, I think, but might not be the best choice. We have Prisma, which is Publicaciones y Revistas Sociales y Humanísticas. This is a comprehensive reference resource providing full-text scholarly journals in the social sciences and humanities for the interdisciplinary academic study of Hispanic and Latin America and the Caribbean Basin. Well, there's this wonderful term, full-text scholarly journals. That's great. Problem is, it's only limited to these areas or to this field. So if you're doing something in those fields, that might be great. This might be a perfect resource for you. But if you're not, then it might not be worth it. Something to add also, this is obviously in Spanish, although, and some of these might also be in Portuguese. But if you speak Spanish and you can read at the academic level in Spanish, I encourage you, of course, to use articles in other languages if you feel comfortable. Okay, it's not a requirement, and I'm certainly not limiting you. If you decide you want to use Spanish texts, that's perfectly fine, but you will have to do the work of translating the material so that I can understand it. I cannot read academic Spanish, and frankly, even intermediate Spanish is kind of a weakness for me. But I still encourage you. I think that's an excellent resource, and you should be able to use it. Okay, you can keep going and read some of these other databases. For now, I'm just going to show you what a database sort of looks like, and I'm going to go ahead and click on JSTOR. We saw that earlier. When you click on one of these databases, it's going to take you off-site. Notice that now that I'm off campus, I'm at home right now, I have to enter my credentials to be able to sign in. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Now that I've signed in, notice it says access provided by UTRGV. Okay, so these are completely free because either you're faculty, your staff, or you're a student at the university. So that's one of the benefits. It's one of the many things you pay for. To put it in perspective, JSTOR requires a subscription, I think, of $100 a year. That's just for one database. So you can imagine how much money you're saving by paying, the small fee that you pay for all your classes. I think it's something like $400, $500 as a fee. Well, that covers even just your access to many of these databases. So it's incredible just how much money is spent by the university to keep access to these. So just like Google, you'll notice that these databases will have a search bar. Where the search bar is located depends. Sometimes it's over here or over here. It depends on each website. If I search something, let's say immigration and assimilation, and I search, I have 26,000 results, and they range obviously in date. Some of these this one was published in 1934. Another one from 1934, 1998, 2007, 1934 again, and so on. Some of these also will say review. If it says review, that means it's not an article. It is a review of something else. In this case, Hannibal Duncan wrote a book review on a book called Immigration and Assimilation. So not to be confused with its own article. Obviously, we can narrow it down. If you're not interested in reading books, you can narrow it down and say, well, I only want to read journals. Okay. I also want to see only things that are, let's say, in the last 4 years or so. So let's say 2014. And I'm going to update it. We went from 25,000 to just 733 related to immigration and assimilation. You can go through some of the titles. We have something called the Integration of Groups. This is published in the journal called Ethnicities, Volume 14, Issue Number 3, published June 2014, and it's about 20 pages. It's about 20 pages long. A little bit about what this means. If you see volume and issue number, volume refers to the year that this journal has been published. So this is the 14th volume of the journal Ethnicities, meaning this is the 14th year that they've done this. They don't necessarily have to be consecutive years. Let's say Ethnicities was around for 2 years, then they went on hiatus for a year, and then they came back. well, that would mean they're on their fourth year, but it would be their third volume. So that does tend to happen. But we know that they've had 14 years of publishing, and they're on their third issue of that year. So they probably are published quarterly, right? Every quarter, so 4 times a year. And it just depends on each journal. Obviously, if we wanted to know more about ethnicities, I'd have to obviously Google it. I'd probably type in the word journal to see what comes up. Sure enough, there it is. And I could, of course, read a little bit more about it to find out how it's peer-reviewed and so on, just like we did with the last one. Okay. Obviously, you'll have to go through some of these readings to find out which one is related to yours. If it turns out you don't find anything in JSTOR in this specific database, that doesn't mean it's the end. It means that this database just wasn't for you. You're going to have to use a different database. And it just depends. Sometimes it helps to find a different subject area. Maybe if you're trying to do immigration and assimilation, perhaps criminal justice might be better. Or perhaps history or global security studies. Maybe even political science. It just really depends on which database is going to help you find the information best. Okay. Well, I think that's all the time I have at the moment. Keep in mind this is due April 1st. I encourage you, of course, to email me if you have any questions. Text me if you'd like. If you even like to call me, that's perfectly fine too. I just ask that you send me an email or text in advance so that we can make sure that we're both available. Last thing, we still have Friday office hours. I was a little disappointed no one joined me for office hours this past Friday. It's not a requirement at all. It's not a requirement. It's just, just like normal office hours. But I do set aside 2 hours out of my schedule to make sure that I meet with you or I'm at least available. If nobody shows up to this next one, I might just cancel those Friday office hours so that way there's more time available for me and I can get other work done instead of sitting at my computer waiting for students to come to me. Let me know if you'd still like to work with me, if you think office hours for Fridays are great. If that time doesn't work for you, we can try to find something else, but my time is limited and I can't be available at any time. There are times during the day when I have meetings or I'm teaching my face-to-face classes and so on. Okay. Take care, and I'll check in with you sometime Wednesday when I post the next week's materials.